Thank you to Stephen and to CEDA for the invitation to speak to you all today. It's incredibly gratifying to be sharing the stage with, I think, two of this country's most impressive women leaders in Catherine and Anna, and I'm looking forward to hearing about their insights after lunch. Now, I am conscious that I'm standing between 300 people and lunch, so I'm going to try and be as economical as I can as we maybe set the scene for why it is that a year after I contributed that chapter to the CEDA Women in Leadership report last year, we still really struggle with the perceptual barriers presented by occupational stereotypes and stereotypes of gender. So I'd like to start with a graphic that is actually extraordinarily simple, probably familiar to some of you, but also I think really informative. This is ASX 200 listed companies, and this is the representation of men and women at different levels in organisations, large listed organisations. Two things are immediately obvious from this graphic. The first is that at entry-level positions, entry-level graduate positions, women outnumber men, 60-40. The other really obvious point about this graphic is that by the time women reach the mid-levels in an organisation, they've all but disappeared. And the obvious question, I guess, is why? Why this mass exodus of women once they hit mid-level in their careers or mid-level in organisations? And this graphic is replicated across every organisation I've worked with and every large listed organisation you care to do this kind of statistical rundown on. Is it simply a fact that women are fundamentally ill-suited to leadership by and large, across every sector, across all kinds of industries in large organisations? That's not an explanation that I find particularly compelling. So the question, of course, is where do the women go once they hit mid-level management? Certainly there are structural and systemic barriers that women face at that point in their career, because mid-level of your career is also when you are most likely to be starting a family for women, right? So the two coincide. And we hear a lot, and we talk a lot, and we work a lot on those systematic and structural barriers. And it's crucial to continue to address them, but they don't actually completely explain the absence of women from senior leadership roles. For example, women who don't start families also experience a stalling in their career at mid-level. And the other factor, of course, is that if it was just taking a little bit of time out to have children, then women would be returning to mid-level roles just a little bit later than their male counterparts, rather than not at all. And so, as a psychologist, I guess, the really fascinating barriers that I think contribute to this jaws of gender graphic are actually perceptual ones. And that's what we're going to talk mostly about, I think, today. So, most of our perceptions, in fact, about gender are based on stereotypes rather than on facts. And stereotypes are the most pervasive form of what organisations now commonly refer to as unconscious bias. Stereotypes about gender and stereotypes about most socioeconomic groups actually fall along two key battle lines or two key behavioural dimensions. The first relates to interpersonal warmth, caring, nurturance, interrelatedness, and women, of course, are stereotyped to have more of this than men. The second of those dimensions relates to competence, assertiveness, drive, dominance, power. And of course, stereotypically, men are thought to have more of those qualities than women. And it turns out that no matter how small or non-existent actual gender differences are, we tend to be guided more by our stereotypical assumptions, unconscious stereotypical assumptions, than we are by the facts. Even if you think you're actually quite enlightened and modern and you don't really buy into gender stereotypes, think again. This is actually data that we've collected with mid to senior level leaders in large organisations in Australia this year, right? Just an illustrative example. When you actually assess the extent to which people have these unconscious stereotypical assumptions around gender, you find something quite disturbing. 80% of mid to senior level leaders believe that women are more warm, caring and relational than they are competent and assertive. 80% of leaders also think that men are more assertive and driven and competent than they are warm and relational. It's quite striking, and no matter how egalitarian or modern we think we are, and no matter how insulated we think we are in our decision-making around capability in organisations, at the unconscious or implicit level, we're still very much in the dark ages when it comes to our assumptions around gender. This wouldn't be too much of a travesty if it was not for the fact that when you look at stereotypes around leadership, you get a rather annoying pattern emerging. So stereotypes of leadership also fall along these two fault lines of assertiveness and competence versus warmth and interrelational qualities. When you look at the extent to which mid to senior level leaders have unconscious assumptions that leadership is around assertiveness and drive and ambition and strength and power, almost all of them, 90% of mid to senior level leaders, believe that to be the case at the unconscious level. This is the think manager, think male phenomenon, where we think of leadership qualities, we tend also to associate them with qualities that are stereotypically masculine. So there's this disjunct, at least at the unconscious level, when it comes to thinking about women and when it comes to thinking about leadership capability. The two don't form a natural fit as far as our unconscious brain is concerned. So when capable women hit mid-level leadership and they start to be appraised in relation to the characteristics that we associate with leadership, there's a perception of lack of fit. It's not a natural combination. And here is how those assumptions tend to manifest. They are, of course, stereotypes, and we hear them a lot. The first is this idea that women aren't as ambitious as men. They don't have the same will to lead as men, that not as many women actually really want to get to the top table as men, right? Hear this a lot. The research, however, shows that this is actually not really true. We have a growing body of reliable research now that shows that women are every bit as ambitious as men. They want to get to the top table every bit as much as men do. The difference, though, is that they're less optimistic that their organisation can support their career aspirations. Now, that's a fairly telling insight on the part of people who respond to research like this. It points the finger at organisational and leadership culture as the source of women's so-called lack of ambition rather than at women themselves, and I think that's a really important distinction to make. The second one is a topic that I've written on in the research scene quite a lot, actually, and spoken on quite a lot. It's this idea that women don't have as much merit as men. So we're a merit-based organisation. We only make hiring decisions on the basis of merit. So if there are not large numbers of women in the senior ranks of my organisation, that's because they don't have as much merit. There aren't as many women with as much merit as there are men, right? Tony Abbott's cabinet comments kind of come to mind when we talk about women of merit. The funny thing is that women are entering organisations as capable, qualified graduates at a rate higher than men are, right? And they're doing fine until they get to a certain point in their careers. Does their merit then rapidly evaporate into thin air? Where does it go? Do they suddenly lack merit that they used to have before? We know now from another emerging body of research that even when men's and women's objective performance is rated to be the same, subjectively, women's performance will still be rated as lower than men. So, in fact, it turns out that women have to outperform men in order to receive the same performance rating. It points to the fact that our appraisals of what merit is, what it looks like and who has it, are not actually as objective as we think they are. Merit is whatever I think it is at the time, essentially. This body of research also conveniently knocks out our next kind of stereotypical assumption about why this jaws of gender graphic exists, and this is one I love, the so-called confidence gap. Women don't have enough confidence. If they would just lean in more, then they'd get to the top more. Women should close their confidence gap. The problem is that when women do lean in more, they violate our stereotypical expectations of what women are supposed to be like, and that translates into some very real consequences. They're hired less, they're liked less, they're rated as less competent, they're paid less, and they're promoted less, relative to the man standing beside them who's also leaning in. So you get the same behaviour, but you have a different outcome. Leaning in doesn't pay off for women the way that it pays off for men. In fact, we have some more interesting data showing that you know, that old adage that women don't apply for a job unless they meet all of the criteria, whereas a bloke will apply if he meets, 60%. If you actually dig a little bit further, it is true, women are more reluctant to apply for a role unless they meet all of the criteria, not because they lack confidence in their ability, though, but because they lack confidence in hirers' ability to recognise their potential. Not surprising, given how much more women have to outperform men in order to get a look in the first place. So in fact, women are just perceiving the fact that they're less likely to get hired anyway unless they're hideously overqualified. So I don't think the confidence gap is really as big an explanation for the jaws of gender as it's purported to be. Do women lead differently to men? Women have a different leadership style, and we hear that a lot in organisations. The data tells a very different story, unfortunately. We have some fairly compelling data from very large samples from SHL, from Zenga Folkman, from lots of academics working in the university space to show that the differences in leadership style between men and women are virtually indistinguishable in leadership style. You need a magnifying glass to find them, where they exist at all, in fact. So the expectation of difference seems to be creating a difference where none naturally exists. If you wanted to find a caring, sharing, transformational leader, hiring a woman is no more likely to get you that than hiring a man. That's how small the differences in leadership style are. I think blind audition research shows this most starkly, and many of you will probably be familiar with that research showing that when you can't see what gender the musician is, you can't actually distinguish their playing style. Orchestra directors used to insist that the reason there were no women in orchestras was because they had a different playing style to men. Not worse, just different and not in style at the moment, despite the fact that women outgraduate men from music schools. And it turns out when you can't see who's playing, you actually can't tell whether they're a man or a woman. So this idea of different playing styles turns out to be a product or an artefact of our expectation of difference rather than real differences. So despite data showing that stereotypical perceptions don't actually match reality terribly often, despite the more enlightened of us swearing that we don't really buy into gender stereotypes anyway and we're very objective in our decision making, we only make decisions on merit, we know from the research consistently that we're far more likely to be influenced by stereotypes than by facts. And we have far too much confidence in our ability to be objective decision makers. My argument today, of course, is that aside from the very real structural barriers that we need to be tackling, much of the jaws of gender actually comes from these perceptual obstacles, and they may be a little bit easier to deal with at the organisational level than some of the structural ones. So there's a real opportunity there, I think, for organisations to get ahead. Women don't lack ambition, they don't lack merit or confidence, they don't have a unique feminine leadership style, and yet we continue to make decisions about their capabilities as if they did. I'd like to finish with a thought experiment, something for you to think on or chat about over lunch. What do you think that jaws of gender graphic that I started with would look like if we closed the pay gap, if flexible work was the norm, if men and women who became parents made decisions about how to work on an equal footing, that is, they took up flexible and part-time roles at a fairly similar level, if leadership culture actually valued a broader range of traits and characteristics and capabilities rather than the strictly masculine ones, and if we trained our people leaders and people decision makers to more effectively recognise talents, whether it comes dressed as a man or a woman, I think it might look like this. What do you think? Thank you very much.